This presentation is on the book The Underground Church by Brian Sanders. It is a criticism of the current structure of the church with a recommendation on how better to match the structure of the church with the current culture. When someone suggests reforming the church, there will always be some hesitation because we're used to our traditional service. But the idea that the church will reform is actually an older tradition than the current service that we are attending on Sunday mornings. There's a Latin term, ecclesia semper reformandum est. My pronunciation of Latin will not be the best. This means the church always in reform. So though the reform will happen, what will not change is the gospel message. It may be delivered in a new context, a new language, a new structure, but the gospel message and taking that to the world will always be the center of what the church is to do. Now, we all inherit a structure, a tradition of service, and no matter how inspired that service and structure may be, we always, as Christians, need to be reviewing whether the structure is aligned with the current culture. And that is the point of the book, Underground Church. So what are some key indicators that the structure of the church is not really aligned with the culture? Status quo, consumption, blue ocean. What do I mean by that? The status quo, when you just cannot continue doing and following that same familiar path. You're uncomfortable with the current status. Also, the church becomes consumption, where you're just attending things and you're told what to think and how to live, that it's just going through the motions. Also, if you do feel this way, there's a caution, and that's what the blue ocean is that a lot of the reason that someone may feel like they're consumers is because they're not feeling as involved in the church as they should be. So then they go out and they recreate the same structure that currently is what they're leaving, so they can be more involved. But that structure isn't reaching the culture, and you're just repeating it, and you end up competing for the same congregation that is already being served by the current structure. This quote stuck out to me. I mean to awaken the imagination of Christians who sit in churches every week pondering the sad ineffectiveness of it all. So let's move to the critique. The author brings attention to two components, pastor as celebrity versus Jesus as Lord, and that the church attendance is often a spectator sport versus the priesthood of believer. So when we're reviewing the pastor as celebrity, the author claims that most of the pastors are often people that have good stage presence and they're good with a microphone, which really limits the number of possible people within the congregation that could be that leader or that pastor. And ultimately, the largest churches are led by the best performers, not necessarily the strongest Christian or the most mature Christian. And points out that also that the way that you measure the impact of this is by attendance, or more likely giving per unit. And the danger of the pastor as a celebrity is that we often create an idol of the pastor, and that idol in the pastor really cannot live up to the requirements that is needed for leading the church. The leader is Christ, who is perfect, and these are all fallen people. So that makes them highly likely that there will be some type of scandal at some point. We are all going to have some type of imperfection that's going to show up. Also, as a visionary of the church, with a visionary you have believers. That means you're attributing God-like gifts to the leader. Now, my personal opinion is I think the author is taking this example and being a little harsh. We see that some of the gifts of overseers and deacons and leaders of the church is to be able to preach and teach, but there certainly is some criticism here and some danger that needs to be identified and maybe mitigated. So then what I think the better critique is, and it does come from this pastor as celebrity and visionary, where you really are putting most of the emphasis and work and leading of the church really in just a handful of people, is you cause the church to become a spectacle. Most of the people that are attending are out in the congregation. They don't have much to contribute. They're there to hear a sermon and to be taught. So that church is a spectacle because there is this one celebrity pastor is certainly, I think, the stronger criticism that the author makes. And he gives an analogy of pickup football versus his days playing high school football, where he grew up in Florida, and they would get together and just play football in the neighborhood, where it could be 5, 7, 11, 15 people on a team, but they were always playing. And he looks at this and reflects back on it whenever he would play high school. And in high school, there would always be some really good players that played most of the time. And then there were other individuals that would get some play time, but most of the team would stand out on the sidelines. And the most people were actually in the stands. So they never even played. So it's this notion that, yes, you're trying to put the best people in these positions, but you end up having a lot of spectators and very few players. And really, the church should be trying to get more involvement, not less involvement. This brings us to the notion of a congregation of clergy, where Martin Luther claims we are all equally priests. And this is from good authority. 1 Peter 2, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a priestly kingdom. And 1 Corinthians 4:1, no one should regard us as anything else than ministers of Christ and dispensers of the mysteries of God. I'm going to end this section with the quote from a book. The underground is not just a critique of the unengaged forms of church. It is a way of building structures that are able to include, empower, and equip activists to carry the goods of grace into the very real needs of the world. The book does bring several comparisons that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention, where it's Jerusalem versus Antioch, centripetal versus centrifugal, modality versus sodality, sheep pen versus battleship, institution versus network. The battleship is actually something that I included, but I wanted to go over a few of these to try to continue to build out the authors. Let's review the framework, and the framework built around that pastor as a celebrity, where that's the expert with the treatment plan. And the church really becomes a hospital for sinners, where there is an ability for the power of the intellectual to do spiritual rehabilitation, that we simply can have our sin taught out of us. And this is that centripetal, where things are collapsing. It draws people inward. And this, I think of Jerusalem, where there's this holy temple, this building where you go to see an intermediary, a high priest that's going to intercede between you and God. And there's a law that can be there to help bring and teach you correct behavior, correct feelings, correct thought, versus, instead of Jerusalem, the first Gentile city of Antioch, where Christianity begins to expand, and it's not about an intermediary between you and God. It's where the Holy Spirit literally dwells within your body, because that is the new temple, and it's the Holy Spirit that will be able to bring salvation. So what is the business model of the current structure? And it really is centered around the Sunday morning service. That is the core service provided. So the author talks about this being a consumer premise, that the product is offered on Sunday morning. The author is challenging on us on what really is the church. We as believers know the church is the body. It's not the building, but we so much emphasize the building or the grounds or maybe even the advertisement budget. But the author is trying to get us to understand not only is the church the people, we're rich in people. And we're actually scarce in buildings, money, and clergy. And we need to be looking at how we can better utilize the resources that we have, and that there is an abundance of people within the body, and getting those people engaged and active and equipped is what's going to help us take the gospel message to the world. So then, how do we go from the building being the church to the church being the body and on mission? And the author is saying that we need a new kind of church in a network world, where we're removing ourselves from being inside that building, where it's safe, and taking the gospel message out to the. So what would a reformed structure within a network culture look like? It would be a model of empowerment, or that is the goal of the author. And that empowered church structure really focuses on four things: the size, the calling, servanthood, and abundance. The author rightly claims that the church in its most potent form is small, and he gives the example of China, where there's been enormous growth. In 1982, there were 1.3 million Christians. By 2002, 90 million Christians, and it's expected by 2024 that China will be the most populous Christian nation in the world. To be sure, we cannot just replicate the Chinese model. The point that the author is making is that structures need to reflect the culture. So we can't just repeat what they've done. But it certainly can demonstrate how growth can happen while honoring the small, simple, and minimalist church. The challenge for the West is really to be comfortable with these small numbers, but this will allow greater contextualization versus the empire building of the current model, where you create a monoculture as a one size fits all. He then also talks about calling, and this is different from vision, where you're following somebody else's vision. Calling is finding your unique place in the mission of God, and that calling is a fulfillment of our craving for both intimacy and mission. And that empowerment means helping people to hear their call and to understand themselves as servants to a group of people who are lost or poor and in need of the kingdom. So the empowerment or equipping of individuals, a lot of times done through small groups, plus that calling will create obedient servants. Those obedient servants will be empowered servants, and servants who learn to lead, not leaders who learn to serve. Now we're moving into abundance, where there is more than enough. And the author gives a lengthy explanation through a story about a company called Waze. And I would recommend reading that story. But for this context, I think it's a better example with Airbnb. That Airbnb is a hotel company that doesn't own a single bed. Or another example, Uber is a taxi company that doesn't own a car. They were able to use the people and the ingenuity and innovation really to figure out how to become the largest hotel, the largest cab company, without really expending capital on the cars and the hotel buildings. I'm going to wrap this up, and I'm going to kind of go back to the structure of the current church versus what the author believes the revised structure, or that network structure, how it would help reach the unreached. So the current version has the clergy or the staff, where let's say that's 10 people for the current church, and they're really supported by 100 individuals that are volunteers, leaders of the church. And this 110 people really are focused on trying to feed the 1,000 people in the congregation, versus figure 2, where you have the 10 people, instead of being clergy and staff, they're equippers. They're trying to help people understand and become leaders and follow their calling. So then the next 100 people are those individuals that are the church planters. And the 1,000 people, instead of being spectators within the church, where they're coming in on just a Sunday to listen to a teaching, they become actively involved and connected with the church planters, and then that group can then minister and feed the 10,000. So it allows the church to reach greater people. Ultimately, the difference between network versus institution is networks exhibit less control over their constituents. They're not necessarily concerned about how the gospel message is being delivered, but that it is being delivered, and they're allowing a lot more autonomy and to try to develop that leader within the congregation and move away from the spectator. Let's move into governance, or really how to apply this notion of networked culture to the structure of the church. So the key difference between institution and network really is who makes strategy. Both are going to have mission, vision, values. It's just going to be in a slightly different order for the network. Let's review the mission, which is going to be the same for both network and institution. Mission is the why we exist. It's that galvanizing declaration that we all can point to and say, this is our why. The book has an example for the underground church, which is to serve leaders and empower the people of God to do the work and the will of God. We've also heard Darren mention following Jesus for the good of our neighbors. So let's review values, and they're going to be a little bit different for networks and institutions. Both of them are going to have it, but the values are really what hold the network together. Those clearly defined values create a unity. They create non-negotiables, things that we cannot live without. And then it should be something that's reaching out so that we admit that we don't actually fully live this, but it's the practice that we want to adhere to. The vision, or the how. So let's review all three of these together to see if I can bring this to fruition. The mission is the why, the purpose. The values are how you do things, or accountability. It is what it means to belong. The vision is what you do, or the strategy. And within the network, you want to have the values and the mission outlined, and then let each of the micro churches, those smaller groups of people, create their own vision, the how. And so long as it's within the values and they're achieving the mission, that's okay. Before the next section, I wanted to pull this early part of the book where the author says love is reductionism. And the author means that if you really want to know something, if you want to understand it deeply, you need to strip it down part by part to understand how each of the parts fit together and what their role is within that item that you, or that thing that you love. So taking that notion of love is reductionism, the underground church decided that they really wanted to find out what they mean by church. And they came to what they call the ecclesial minimum. What is the least amount of structure that is required to be considered a church within their network? They call that the ecclesial minimum. And they have three key areas: worship, community, and mission. And that worship is in consistent, devoted, and surrendered relationship to Jesus Christ. Community, or being totally accountable and committed to each other. And mission, being engaged in his mission, making disciples and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. And as I reflected on these, the author talked about home churches and talked about them being a franchise model where you're just kind of reproducing, and the author's really into innovation. I think that's an appropriate focus for us. It seems that we're more interested in focusing on that community aspect. And then the underground is really about the mission and creating new outreach programs to take the gospel out, and they really have a strong emphasis and a heavy heart for the poor. So it makes sense that that's the direction that they went. The author spends a lot of time talking about the advantages and the superiority of networks over institutions, but he doesn't abandon institutions altogether. He is actually making the claim that the church should be both centralized and decentralized, that maximal networks serve the minimal small-sized churches, that it's a combination of both network and institution. There is an example of the combination of network and institution, or that centralized and decentralized structure for the underground church. And in the diagram on the right, starting at the board of directors and going down to program and assets, that's the centralized institutional component of their networked church, where they're providing training and finance, coaching, facility, and media for the network of small churches on the left. And that's where the network is. That's where visions are being created to really take the gospel message out to the world, and providing that contextualization. So the purpose of the centralized hierarchy is to serve the network. What was interesting is the only people to receive salaries in this model are those equippers on the right. And this makes sense. A lot of times this is going to be a full-time job. Many of them would have families, so it would be very difficult for them to be able to provide for themselves financially as they're doing the training, the financing, the coaching, the facility, and the media. They're providing these things, but they're not the celebrity in the system. There's a separation there, and they're there just to support an active congregation of clergy. I'm going to wrap up here with the sacraments. Now, the underground recognizes only the Eucharist and baptism, just like the rest of us Reformed believers. But they do have ordained as a sacrament, sort of. I would put this in all lowercase if the font on the PowerPoint would let me do so. But I think it's important because it's going back to, it's an outward profession of an inward faith, and having the ability to ordain elders as leaders of their microchurch is that outward profession. So it's a ritual that they use to help equip their leaders in the churches to take the gospel message, which is the point of the underground and the overall church. Thank you.